All right. So when we start the Seder, the Passover Seder, we always start with Kaddish, which means we make Kiddush. Then we go on to wash our hands, we break the middle matzah, and then eventually, a couple of steps in, we get to the step called Magid. And Magid is when we tell the story of the Exodus and everything that is surrounding that as well. We do much more than just telling the story of the Exodus, but that's kind of the point. Magid means to tell. So we're going to start at that point. We begin Magid with the famous Ma Nishtana, the Ma Nishtana being the 4 questions that a child asks. So, I lost you guys. Share my screen. All right, could you all see my screen? So, here we go. So here we get to the section called the Ma Nishtana, and this is the 4 questions that typically a child will ask, although it does not have to be a child. And if there are no children, then an adult should say it as well. And the 4 questions that the child asks is, why on this night are we dipping? The second question, why are we eating matzah and no chametz? Different than usual. On the third question, the child is picking up on the difference. How come tonight we're eating bitter herbs, bitter vegetables? And lastly, is asking why tonight we are eating in a reclining position, because of course on Passover night we need to eat the matzah and drink the wine while leaning to the left. So just one interesting thing that I want to point out, there's much conversation and discussion as to the order of these 4 questions. And if you look in different texts where this section has been presented, you find different opinions as to what the correct order is, to which question should go first. Are we is this the order of what the child sees first? If we're going what the child sees first, then we would probably go with leaning, because the first step of the Seder is to lean when you drink the wine. And that would be what the child is seeing first. Or maybe you would say the child is first seeing the no chametz and seeing the matzah, because that's what's been going on for a couple of days. Either way, the order that we have in front of us right here, which is based on many commentaries and many places, is a very interesting order, because we begin with the concept of dipping, moving on to chametz and matzah, and moving on to maror, and then leaning. Now, question number 2, 3, and 4 make sense in that order, because eating matzah, not eating chametz, is a biblical commandment. Nowadays, in 2021, living outside of Israel, to eat matzah and not to have chametz in your house is still a biblical commandment. On the other hand, question number 3, which is not eating maror, eating bitter herbs, nowadays it's only considered to be of rabbinic decree. Although the Torah itself, the Bible itself, does say one should eat maror, bitter herbs, on the night of Passover, it's contingent, biblically speaking, it's contingent upon the consumption and the eating of the Passover sacrifice, which we no longer have. So it was the rabbis that said, okay, although the Torahs, the Bible's contingencies do not exist, we, so to say, we put into place that one should still eat the bitter herbs on the night of Passover. And similar thing with the leaning. The idea of leaning, it's not a biblical obligation. It has the level of a rabbinic obligation. So question number 2 is, in other words, in terms of stringency of, if you will, so to say, importance, question number 2 is kind of at the top, because that's biblical. Question number 3 is next in level of importance, because it originates in biblical writings, but practically nowadays it's of rabbinic origin. It only has the strength of a rabbinic decree. And the 4th question is a straight up rabbinic decree where you're supposed to lean. The idea of leaning is because historically that was a way that free and wealthy people would dine and they would eat, is in a way of kind of lounging. So we do that to show that we're free people. However, question number one, the idea of dipping, it's not biblical. It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that you have to dip, vegetables in salt water. It doesn't say you have to dip maror or matzah in the paste-like substance called charoset. It's what's called a custom. As kind of Passover began to evolve and we moved on, and throughout history, it developed as a Jewish custom. So you have a very odd situation where the first question that the child is asking, and again, this is not the child's order, this is the authors, the rabbis that put this together, when they chose what order to write the questions in, the question is, why are we putting the question about dipping first? It's not the first thing the child sees. And on a level of importance, if anything, it should be at the bottom. It's not a biblical decree. It's not a rabbinic decree. It's a custom from Jewish people. If one, for example, didn't dip, but he still ate matzah and maror on Passover Seder, it's not the equivalent to eating matzah. There's a hierarchy of importances over here. If one is not feeling well, if a person is limited by time, there's a structure, there's some things that come first and some things that come second. So dipping the vegetable in the salt water and the maror and the matzah in the paste like charoset is not at the top of the charts. It's a beautiful custom. So that's the question. The question is, why is that first? And the Rebbe, at one address, he pointed this out, and he said a very interesting thing, that it's for that reason that it was put first, in order that we should not, God forbid, make the mistake of thinking that a custom is unimportant, or a custom is not so important, or a custom can be kind of just browsed over. And tradition, right? The concept of tradition is to be treated with respect. Now, that's not to say that if it's a made-up tradition, and we have no shortage of Jewish jokes as to why people do certain things. The one about the lady that always cuts off the edge of the brisket, and she went to ask her grandmother, and she said because she didn't have a pan that fit in it. So there's no shortage of baba maises that came up. But the idea of, if it's a minhag, if it is a custom that has been accepted and been done by so many Jewish people, it's of tremendous importance. The fact that everyone does it, that in itself is where it gets its importance from. To the extent that we have a saying that says minhag Yisrael, a custom of Jewish people, Torah becomes a part of the Torah. And the Rebbe went on even further to say that when we are trying to influence and make a mark on a child, trying to give him that long-lasting impression of something that's going to stick out to him, because the whole idea of the questions is that we're trying to provoke the children's interest. We don't want to just babble on the whole night and say, well, this is the story and this, that, and the other. The Torah says clearly, it says in the verse, Ki yishelcha bincha, when your child will ask, and then you will tell him. We know there's 4 different sons. Each child asks a question differently. Each child approaches the night with a different attitude, and we need to address each one in a way that they understand and in a way that they relate to it. But the idea is that when it comes to customs, A, we cannot overlook the importance of custom, and B, when it comes to addressing and educating children, we have to recognize that customs will play a tremendously important role and will find a very deep place in their hearts of these people. And often you do see that. You see people that have grown up and have been many, many years without a connection, without an obvious connection, so to say, to the Jewish people. But they remember customs that were done in their house, certain traditions that they had, sometimes certain songs that they had. There's this recollection that they have from their youth. So it's an interesting thing just for you to know that the order of these 4 questions is done deliberately. It's questioned as to where this order comes from. And in the particular order that you see in front of you, with dipping being the first question, it immediately raises a question as to why that would come first. And the answer is that we're choosing specifically and deliberately to highlight customs and say yes, matzah is biblical and maror originates in the Torah and then moved on to the rabbinic decree. But we are starting with dipping because we're recognizing that to the child, the customs are important. They are the ones that are going to leave a big impression on him. And God forbid, we do not want to just give off that impression, that the customs are the unimportant things. So that is the first thought that I wanted to share with you. Does anybody have any questions or comments that they would like to add to that? All right, speak now or forever hold your peace. All right, so in the Haggadah, what happens is we go on after the 4 questions and we begin with this very famous paragraph. It's interesting that in Yiddish, before we ask the 4 questions, we say, Tater will by dir fragen 4 kashas, which means, Father, I want to ask you 4 questions. And then when you finish asking the 4 questions, you say, Tater bei dir gefragt 4 kashas. Father, I have now asked you 4 questions. Jetzt geb mir a tirutz. Now please provide me an answer. And then when, the father or whoever's leading the reading of the Seder, he would usually say in Yiddish, Der teretz is, which means the answer is, avodim hayinu lefarei b'mitzrayim. We started off as slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and now we're kind of answering the child's questions, just obviously going to be not directly answered in one go, but it's going to be now a whole long thing. So what do we say in this paragraph? We said, this is how the story goes. We started off as slaves to the Pharaoh in Egypt, until God liberated us from there with what they call a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Basically, a lot of big miracles. Now, the particular English that I'm reading is written in a very casual style to keep people entertained. But it's the basic translation is correct. In fact, if he hadn't taken us out of there, we would still be slaves, our children would be slaves, our grandchildren would be slaves, and so on. Nobody would have even thought of the whole idea of freedom. That's why we're telling the story tonight. Even if we would all be wise and understanding, even if we all knew everything that's written in the Torah and all the holy books, it would still be a mitzvah for us to tell the story tonight. And the more you tell the story, the better. So, let's tell the story. So a couple of things that I want to pick up over here. We say that v'ilu lo hotzi HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if God would not have redeemed us, then we, us, and our children, and our grandchildren, everybody would still be slaves in Egypt. So the obvious question asked by many of the commentaries is why? God took us out of Egypt, 3,500 years ago. So what's to say that if God wouldn't have taken us out, that the Egyptian empire would still be in existence? Maybe 1,000 years later would have crumbled and the Jewish people would have left. We say if God wouldn't have taken us out, we would still be slaves. Who said? I mean, what's the proof? If God wouldn't have taken us out, so then, I don't know, something else would have happened. Why, if God would not have taken us out, would we still be slaves? Why would we still be slaves? Many different answers, but one answer that I want to share with you is as follows. We do see that when the Jewish people left Egypt, they kept complaining about their situation that they found them, that they had in the desert, and they kept saying things like, "Oh, we shouldn't have left Egypt," or certain groups even tried to return to Egypt. And the idea is that even if technically, if God would not have taken us out, even if technically we would have somehow made it out afterwards, we would have returned to slavery. And we see this idea that, the freedom was expensive. The freedom was difficult. If God would not have taken us out, what would have happened is slavery would have become so much a part of who we are, then yes, even if technically the Egyptian empire would have crumbled, we would have become slaves to something else or someone else. And what we're really celebrating on the eve of Passover, as explained by the great Maharal of Prague, is not actually the physical liberation, but more the spiritual liberation. And what I mean by that is that when God took us out of Egypt, he liberated our souls to the point that no matter what would happen after that, we would always be free. So let me put it to you in this way. If God would not have taken us out, perhaps physically and geographically, we would have left Egypt, but we would forever be slaves. The idea of being, having a soul, having a part of you that no matter what and no matter where can never be enslaved, we would not have received. And then it would have been just a matter of time till we would have become a slave to something or someone somewhere. But now that God took us out, when he did take us out, he gave us the gift of an innate freedom. It's a freedom that exists within the deepest part of, our consciousness, of our soul, to the point that no matter where we go, no matter what happens, whether we are in Spain in the 1400s or in Auschwitz in 1940s, a person still has the ability to be free. And that's what we mean when we say that if God would not have taken us out, we would have still been slaves. Because yes, we've been through other slaveries past Egypt, but God freed our souls to the point that we can then be in a place, in an environment, in a situation, and we get to choose how we respond. We can always be true to who we are. We can always remain connected to Hashem, which is what it means to be free. On the other hand, if God had not taken us out at that point, then even if geographically and physically we might have made it out 100, 200 years later, but ultimately it would have just been a matter of time till we found a new master and become slaves again. So in summary, we're saying over here that if God would not have taken us out, we would have been slaves, because basically we would have somewhere along the way returned to slavery, as we see how many people were pestering us throughout the generations. Because what we did receive what we did receive at the Exodus from Egypt is not so much as a geographical freedom. We went from Egypt now into the desert, because the desert was also a risky place. But at that moment, God put something inside of us. He gave each one of us an innate freedom where we can always be connected to him, the big H, the him with a capital H, who's bigger than anything of this world. And from that day on, no matter where a person went, no matter who a person met, we always have it within us to be connected to Hashem, and therefore choose to be free no matter what the situation is. Any comments?
I think that when you were saying that you'd never be free, I agree with that, but I think part of it is because there was no leader. No one thought that they could do anything other than what they were still doing. So had not Moses been sort of pushed into being the leader, and with Aaron and Miriam's help get everyone out eventually, I think he would have been trapped. Nobody would have thought the end. They were
Right.
to be slaves.
Yeah, which is kind of connects to the idea that what I was saying is that through that redemption, then it was planted that seed in everyone's mind that no, we don't have to be slaves. And, even at times in the future when we were enslaved temporarily by other people, this idea of freedom was planted in our minds. And, even if the Jewish people were tortured or were made to suffer under other people's hands, we always knew that this doesn't have to be who we are. We don't have to, this is not really who we are, and freedom is going to come around the corner. All right, thank you for that. So we end off by saying that we're telling the story, and even if we're wise and understanding, even if we're the smartest guy, the smartest gal out there, we know the whole Torah back and forth. We've did this 100 times. Right, we've been to 1 million seders. It's still a mitzvah to us to tell the story tonight. Not only that, the more you tell the story, the better it is. So along those lines, once we said that even if you're a smart guy, you should tell the story, and the more you tell the story, the better. The Haggadah goes on to give an example. And it says, I'll give you an example, that there was an instance with 5 of the greatest rabbis of that time. This is the time just after the destruction of the Second Temple, where Israel was under Roman rule. 5 of the greatest rabbis were sitting at a Seder in Bnei Brak being the city in Israel. The whole night they were there. telling the story of the liberation from Egypt. The rabbis were Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon. Those were their names. And they didn't stop until their students arrived and said, our teachers, it's already time to say the morning Shema. So literally, what does that mean? It means that in the morning, when the sun comes out, you have a mitzvah, you have a commandment to say the morning Shema. There's a mitzvah to say the Shema in the morning, and there's a mitzvah to say Shema at night. So they said, boom, it's light outside. You've been speaking the whole night. You might not realize you're so engrossed that you need to stop to go and say the Shema. So it's the story on the simple sense is a beautiful story. Is a mitzvah to sit up the whole night, and there's a mitzvah, even if you're a great sage and you know this, you should tell the story as we see the story. But one of the interesting things that we see in this story is that if you look at these 5 people, each one of them, technically, you would have thought that they did not have a real connection, or they did not have an obligation to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Why? Because Rabbi Akiva, this is the great Rabbi Akiva, and we'll start with him, is known to be the descendant of converts. It's famously known that Rabbi Akiva, we know how great he was and what a great sage he was, but he was a descendant of converts, which means that were his own ancestors in Egypt? No, his own ancestors weren't in Egypt. So even though his own ancestors weren't in Egypt, still he was sitting and he was telling the story. We also know from other places that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Tarfon, the 3 of them, were all Kohanim. And Rabbi Yehoshua was a Levi. And according to many opinions, when the Jewish people were in Egypt during those, years of slavery, the tribe of Levi, which would include Levi, the Levites, and the Kohanim, were not actually enslaved. There was always one group of Jews, the tribe of Levi, that they, never got roped in to begin with. So they were never a part of the slavery. So they were not oppressed to the same level as everyone else was oppressed. So you had these rabbis that one of them is a descendant of converts. So his ancestors were never in Egypt. The other rabbis are all from the tribe of Levi. So their ancestors are either Kohanim or Levites, which means that they were not really oppressed, and at least not to the same degree of oppression of the other Jews. So they too cannot say, well, our ancestors, had this back-breaking labor, etc., etc. But yet still every single Jew has this obligation to sit at the Passover Seder and talk about the story, etc. Which does feed into another key point, which is we are not telling a story of something that happened 3,000 years ago. As beautiful and as romantic as that would be, to continue telling a story of something that happened 3,000 years ago, that's not the way we're supposed to be seeing the Passover night. The Passover night is about our story. Like we said a few minutes ago, if God would not have taken us out, we would still be slaves. So the question is, in which way in our lives are we stuck? Are we slaves? To what are we slaves? We need to identify, the slavery and then push for an exodus, push for freedom. So even if our ancestors were not in Egypt, for whatever reason it is, the story is still our story, because the story is a current story. The story is the story of now. How could I incorporate, how is this my story? How do I incorporate these concepts of freedom in my life? I want to point out one other thing, that when the students came, they said that our teachers, it's already time to say the morning Shema. So why didn't the students just say, hey everyone, it's the morning. Time to move on. Why do they say it's time for the morning Shema? So here we have a very beautiful explanation that Chassidus brings, and they said as follows. Twice a day, we have an obligation to say Shema, at night and in the morning. Now, the idea of Shema is announcing declaring our faith in one Hashem, right? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So it's a declaration of our faith that God is one. Now, what does it mean that God is one? God is one and not two. God is one means that God is the only one. God being the only one is the recognition that nothing else has any power. That's first of all. Nothing else has any say as to what happened. Not the government, not your boss, not your spouse, right? Otherwise, technically, you believe in two gods, because if God doesn't have power over what your boss is going to do to you, then you're creating a power out of your boss, and in your mind they have free choice to be able to do whatever they want to you. So then that's already a second God in a certain case. So the real belief in God is one is not only that there's not God and another God somewhere in the heavens, but there's nothing else in the world that has any power. Even further than that, a belief in one God is to believe that nothing in the world has an independent existence, which is not completely dependent on Hashem for its existence. Because if something has independent existence, it exists and is not completely dependent on Hashem for its existence, then in a way, there, so to say, is two gods. There's the one big God, and there's the small God who doesn't need God to exist. If you say God is the one and the only one that has any power, as an extension to that, nothing else in the world, no angel, no spiritual powers, no demons, no forces of evil, nothing exists outside of Hashem, meaning nothing exists without being completely dependent on Hashem. So when we declare our faith, we're not only saying God is the big boss, but we're saying that he's really the only true existence. Everything else is dependent on Hashem for his existence. But this concept is a difficult concept to really internalize, because to really walk around and feel like nothing in this world has any power, has any dominion, has any say, and to really feel like everything in the world is completely dependent on Hashem for its existence is a very, very deep level of faith and deep level of belief to come to. So there's two Shemas. There's the Shema of the night and there's the Shema of the morning. The Shema of the night is saying, I'm at night. It's dark outside. I'm a Jew that doesn't completely feel, I have not yet internalized the message that God is the only existent with every single thing dependent on him. I know that that's the place I should be. I intellectually, I've thought about it, but at the end of the day, I'm saying Shema at night. It's nighttime, it's dark outside, so to say. This idea is not yet shining. I don't live with this. If we did live with it, we would be a perfect tzaddik. We would be completely righteous. So that's the idea of the nighttime Shema. The morning Shema, metaphorically, is saying it's morning, it's bright outside, it's shining, it's light. The Shema is shining. The idea of God being the one and only, with everything else not being a real existence, with everything else having their existence completely dependent of Hashem, is shining. It's obvious. I feel it. I recognize it. And I'm living in this world almost like in Messianic times. So when they came to their teachers, what did they say to their teachers? They said, Rabbi Seinu, our teachers, Higia Zman Kriyat Shema Shacharis, it's already time to say the morning Shema, which means we, the students, have been sitting here and listening to your conversation the whole entire night. You have literally accomplished an exodus, a freedom for all of us, all the students. You have created such an uplifting and such a transformation for all of us that we are now saying the morning Shema. We are now seeing the Adonai Echad, the God is one, the God is the only one, in a way that it's shining and it's bright and we're feeling it. So they came to them, and it wasn't just an announcement that says, it's 7:00 in the morning, let's get on with the show. It was the students responding to the whole night's discussion. And the whole night's discussion was obviously about this, about, what is freedom about? Freedom is about recognizing that we are dependent on Hashem. And this whole conversation, so the students said, you have brought us to the place where it's shining for us. It's the morning Shema. We can say Shema, we can feel, and it's shining to us. You have elevated us to this place where we can not only say, I would like to, realize that Hashem is the only existence, but rather we're able to feel it, and it's shining, it's light outside, it's daytime. You have illuminated this topic and the subject for us to the point where, we're living with it, everything. So their announcement to their teachers wasn't just a practical announcement and say, well, it's time to move on, but rather it was the students saying to their teachers how deeply they have been affected by the evening, the whole night of teaching, etc., etc. Anybody want to add anything to that? All right. So we just mentioned that one of the 5 rabbis was a man called Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So the Haggadah says, here's a conversation that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah had with the other sages about the Exodus from Egypt. So for one thing, Rabbi Elazar pointed out that he was about 70 years old. And again, this English translation is kind of a casual translation, and it gives you a lot of information that's not in the Hebrew. So this is not literal translation, but it says that Rabbi Elazar pointed out that he was about 70 years old. Well, he wasn't really, he was still a teenager, but he miraculously got this distinguished beard so that people would respect him when he was appointed head of the Supreme Court. So he looked 70, and he had the wisdom of a 70-year-old sage. So it's an interesting story that at one point they were looking to reinstate or to instate a new leader, and it fell on Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, but at the time he was a very young man. I think he was 18 years old, and nobody was taking him seriously. So God made a miracle that his beard became white overnight, and that's why he says, that I look like a 70-year-old man, because when he took on this position of leadership amongst the people, he became appointed head of the Supreme Court. Like I said, there had been somebody else, but the other person had kind of been a little bit too tough and had been doing things in too strict of a way. So the rabbis kind of voted to oust the old guy and in with the new guy. The problem was that the new guy, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, was too young. So God made this miracle where his beard grew streaks of white. And the next day when he showed up at the Supreme Court, which was common, they would rule on different questions, etc. He was a very distinguished looking man. Not sure what his wife thought, but so the story goes. So at any rate, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says that there was a discussion amongst the sages of whether or not you have to mention the Exodus every night of the year. And we'll just read the paragraph and then we'll come back. So everything revolves around these words from the Torah. Open quotations. Torah says, in order that you should mention the Exodus from Egypt all the days of your life. So there's an instruction from the Torah to mention it every day of your life. So since we did that already in the morning when we said the last paragraph of Shema, why say the last paragraph again at night? And I need to jump in here with an explanation. When we say Shema twice a day, at least minimum, we say 3 paragraphs of Shema. We say the first paragraph, we say the first sentence together with a paragraph. So the first sentence says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Followed by a paragraph that says, V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, etc., etc. Then we go on to a second paragraph that says, V'hayayim Shemo, and it will be that if you listen to Hashem, you'll get these rewards, and if you don't listen, you'll get punished, etc., etc. And then there's a third paragraph which talks about the mitzvah of wearing tzitzit, the 4-cornered garment that men wear. And that paragraph that talks about the tzitzit ends with a mention of leaving Egypt and Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. Now, technically, the third paragraph is not part of the Shema. For example, in the mezuzah being the scroll that you hang on your door, where one is instructed to write the paragraphs of Shema, it only says the first and second paragraph. There's no third paragraph. The third paragraph is not necessary. It does what makes that part of the Shema. So really what happened, the rabbis took this third paragraph of Shema, what we call the third paragraph, called Vayomer, which talks about tzitzit, and they stuck it on to the Shema. They made it a part of the Shema, because since you have an obligation to say Shema every single day, so by adding the third paragraph, then everyone is going to be saying paragraph 1 and 2, which by doing so, they will fulfill their obligation of saying the Shema, and they will say the third paragraph, which talks about the tzitzit, and at the end, it talks about the exodus from Egypt, and by doing so, they will have fulfilled their obligation of mentioning the exodus from Egypt every single day of their lives. So in simple English, the third paragraph of the Shema that we say every day whenever we say Shema was put there by the rabbis in order to mention Shema, in order to mention the exodus from Egypt as well, because we have a biblical obligation to mention Exodus every single day of our lives. But then in conversation, the rabbi said, but why should we do that at night? There's no reason to say the third paragraph of Shema at night, because you don't have to mention the Exodus from Egypt at night. And to add to that, there's no mitzvah. The commandment to wear tzitzit does not exist at night. The commandment of wearing tzitzit is only by day, which parenthetically is why women are not obligated to wear tzitzit, because the law is that any positive commandment, which is time-bound, women were absolved from. Women were exempt from. So why people think that it's more like specific to women, it's really not. It's a very legalistic and logistical thing. The ramifications became, and the conversation will be for a different time, that any positive commandment, and when I say positive, because the Torah is made up of positive and negative commandments, right? The do's and the don't do's. Don't steal, don't kill, or don'ts. And then there's do's. So any positive commandment, any do mitzvah, which is time-bound, a woman doesn't have to do. A woman is exempt from. So tzitzit only is a mitzvah for the day. So they said, why say the third paragraph at night? Men, no one has to wear tzitzit at night. So there's no reason to say the third paragraph of Shema at night. And you don't have to mention the Exodus from Egypt at night. You already mentioned it in the morning. That was the kind of accepted view, that you only have to say the third paragraph of Shema in the morning and not at night, because you only have to mention, when the Torah says that you should mention the Exodus from Egypt all the days of your life, it means in the day and not in the night. However, Rebbe Lazar ben Azariah, he didn't agree with that. And he wanted to institute that people should also mention, that they should also mention the Exodus from Egypt at night, which would mean they would also be saying the third paragraph of the Shema at night. But the rabbis didn't want to listen to him. However, along came another person whose name was Ben Zoma, which literally means just the son of Zoma. And he said that if you look in the biblical verse, you'll actually see that there's an extra word, which this is done all the time in the Talmud, where we pick up on words of the Torah and we say, could the Torah have said this in less words? And if yes, what does it come to include where the Torah used extra words? Even lettering, they do that. So they'll always ask, could the Torah have said this in less words? If yes, why more? So in the verse, in Hebrew, it says, Kol Yemei Chayecha, that you have to talk about the Exodus from Egypt all the days of your life. So the Ben Zoma said, what's up with the word all? Torah could have just said, mention the Exodus from Egypt, the days of your life. So the word all, there are plenty of other things the Torah tells me to remember, and it's self-understood that I have to remember it every day without being told so. If you don't remember every day, you're not remembering, you're forgetting, right? So Ben Zoma came up with a simple formula. He said as follows: when the Torah says you should mention the Exodus of Egypt during the days of your life, that means in the daytime while the sun is shining. But when the Torah added the word all the days of your life, that means in the daytime plus at the nighttime. So from that extra word all, he said it must be done during the day and during the night. So this exposition, this drasha, this teaching that he said, Rebbe Lazar ben Azariah was very happy with it, because it came to support his decision as head of the court that you should mention the Shema at night as well. So then the Gemara says, then the Haggadah says, what about the other rabbis? The other rabbis, it seems, did not have the same appreciation of Ben Zoma's insight, and they learned the verse differently. They said, okay, we agree with you that there's an extra word in the Torah, but they said it goes like this: days of your life means the life of this world, all the days of your life, with the extra word all, includes the world to come, aka the Messianic era. So according to the rest of the rabbis, Ben Zoma has no proof from this verse. They said, we agree with you that there's an extra word, but it's not to come to differentiate between days and nights. It's to say that days of your life means this life, and all the days of your life come to include the days of Moshiach, that even in the Messianic era, we're still going to mention the Exodus from Egypt. Make sense so far? So that's the simple reading of this paragraph. The simple reading of this paragraph is that there's Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who wants everyone to say the paragraph of Vayomer, the paragraph that talks about tzitzit and the exodus from Egypt, not only during the day, but also at night. And the other rabbis don't agree with him. Ben Zoma came and brought proof for Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's opinion, because it says in the Torah, you should remember the exodus from Egypt all the days of your life. But the other sages said, no, we do agree with you that the word all is extra, but it's not about days and nights. It's about, the current reality, messianic reality.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
I know that the Passover Seder is full of great symbolisms and lessons. Did all these rabbis really historically live at the same time?
The ones that we're mentioning now, yes.
Okay, thanks.
So in this, in other words, these two paragraphs are one after the other. We, like in the historical order, we will jump out soon, but these five rabbis definitely lived in the same time. And this one over here, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, lived at the same time as Ben Zoma. So this is, in a historical concept, this is, which to your point is an interesting thing, because on a metaphoric level, what was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah saying? He said, what did he say? He said that you should mention the exodus from Egypt during the day, but not only during the day, also at night. When did Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah live? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah lived after the destruction of the Second Temple, pretty much right after that, under Roman rule. He was a leader of the Jewish people at night, at a metaphoric nighttime. Things were difficult for them. The temple had just been destroyed, and many, many Jews had just been exiled out into Babylon. This is kind of the historic period where Babylon was building up. This is just before the times when the Mishnah was written. So, he lived at a time where it was night. Spiritually, it was night. The exile was great. The darkness was great. But he said a person should still mention the exodus from Egypt at night, even when times are tough and we don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And we just went into exile. The temple was just destroyed. These people would have had grandparents, or at least great-grandparents for sure, that witnessed the temple while it still stood. If you know the history of Rabbi Akiva's father-in-law was one of those that supported Jerusalem under the siege. Whatever, long story, right? Without getting into the historical stories behind this. But these people were an early generation of exile, and to them it was nighttime. Says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, we need to mention the Exodus also at night, even when things are hard, and even when things are dark, and we don't see how we're going to get out, and we don't see any upcoming freedom, and we don't want to recognize that God could come in and perform a miracle. It's important at nighttime specifically to mention the Exodus and recognize that even when things are no good and things are bad, we need to mention and remember and talk about the Exodus to try and instill within ourselves a feeling of positivity, a feeling of optimism, etc., etc. The other interesting thing is that why did the other sages say that we will mention the Exodus from Egypt even after the Moshiach arrives? Because let's think about that for a minute. Seemingly, after Moshiach comes, then of what relevance is the Exodus from Egypt anymore? Why is that still something important? What do I mean with my question? Now that we live in a world, there still exists evil. We're still battling and struggling with exile, being in a place where we don't see Hashem, and we still suffer. So the Exodus from Egypt, although it happened many years ago, is still a big part of our reality. It makes us who we are today. It was the forming of our nation, etc., etc. But one could ask the question and say, when Moshiach comes, right? There's a messianic revolution, ushers in a redemptive state, after which there's going to be no suffering. The evil from the world will be completely eradicated. At that point, what will be the benefit of mentioning the Exodus from Egypt? Seemingly, the Exodus from Egypt is going to pale in comparison to the Exodus of the exile to the redemptive time. Because at that point, the whole entire world is going to be transformed. And then what value is there? Once upon a time, we were in Egypt. And then we came out of Egypt. Yeah, but when you came out of Egypt, you were still stuck with evil.
Well, it could be that it continues to be a statement, faith, and a statement that God still runs everything.
Yes, and nowadays that's of primary. Gary, you're gonna need to mute yourself every time I speak. So we'll have to take turns. I'll speak, and then I'll mute myself, and then you'll speak, and we'll just go back and forth. So now you're correct, right? When we talk about the Exodus from Egypt, it's as you know, this is a very good point you mentioned. It's about us saying, listen, when all odds were stacked against us in Egypt, God came in and he beat all the odds. He whacked the Egyptians. He took us out. So remember, guys, God is in charge. But let's think about when Moshiach comes, evil is eradicated. There's no more sickness. There's no more disease. We don't even have an evil inclination. So what are we going to sit around and saying, don't worry, God is still the all-powerful because he took us out of Egypt? I mean, God is going to be so obvious to every single person then. What's going to be the value of talking about the Exodus from Egypt? Now I'll mute and you talk.
Well, memory is always important, I think. And even when the Moshiach comes, we should probably realize where we were to enjoy where we are now.
Yeah, it's true. And yeah, the rabbis agreed with you. They said that even after Moshiach comes, we're still going to talk about the Exodus from Egypt. And you do raise a good point. Knowing where we came from will help us appreciate where we are now. I want to add to that, which is as follows. There's two different ways of seeing the Exodus from Egypt and the coming of the Moshiach. One way of seeing it is that these are two disconnected, not connected events. And if that's your attitude, or if that's someone's attitude, then they can ask the question, why talk about the Exodus from Egypt when Moshiach comes? And we can talk about if there is importance or if there's not importance. But there's a completely different starting point, a completely different foundation, which will eradicate the question completely. The Exodus from Egypt was step one of a two-step process, which means the point when God took us out of Egypt and took us out, formed a nation, gave us the Torah at Sinai in the desert, that was all starting a process which ends when Mashiach comes. So they're not two disconnected events. There's that was the beginning of the race, and that was the end of, and Moshiach is the end of the race, and we're now running the race. So when you finish when you get past the finish line, you're not going to say, well, why talk about where the race started? What do you mean? Because when that gun went off, right? Then the Olympics and they shoot that blast and you start running, that's when the race started. And now when Mashiach comes, we're finishing the race. So the two are really connected because from day number one, when God took us out of Egypt, we were running this race. So maybe sometimes walking the race, sometimes crawling the race, but we were on this process of getting to the times of Moshiach. That's been the point the whole entire time. It's not like a disconnected event that one day when God's fed up with the world that we live in, he's going to send Moshiach. From day one, that's where we were marching to. So when Moshiach comes, of course, we're going to talk about the Exodus from Egypt. Who's going to say, hey, 3,000 years ago, the process started. The process started when God took us out of Egypt and he gave us a Torah. And, and now look where we are today with the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash and the temple, etc., etc. So the fact that we mentioned the Exodus from Egypt even after Moshiach comes is because these two events are really the starting point and the finishing point of the same race. It's step one and step two of the same thing, not disconnected things, which talks just in general about the idea of the coming of Moshiach. It's not something that by accident happens at the end when we get to level 100 of Mario, like we're Mario, and when you get to the end, you finish all the levels, then boom, you get the prize at the end, right? That's now what's happening. This has been the point the whole entire time. We've been working towards creating a world and a reality, which is Moshiach, etc., etc. And therefore, it's a no-brainer that when Moshiach comes, we're still going to talk about the Exodus from Egypt, because that was step number one in this two-step process. Now I'm going to mute myself and you can talk.
That's very interesting. I appreciate it.